The portal the monster had ripped open back in Z City should have closed the instant Saitama's fist collapsed the thing's skull. It did not. Instead, the breach yawned wider. The air around it tasted of ozone and something older, like the smell of a library that had been burning for a century. And Saitama, who was already moving forward with the follow-through of his punch, found that his foot had landed on ground that was not ground. He was standing on nothing. There was no pavement beneath him. There were no buildings, no cars, no screaming civilians. There was only the dark, and the stars, and the impossible cold of vacuum, and the white cape that he had not worn in months but that had chosen this exact moment to billow around his shoulders, as though directed by a stagehand who had never heard of physics. Saitama said. He looked around. He had no helmet. He had no oxygen. He had, technically, no reason to still be alive. But being alive was a thing his body had decided to keep doing approximately 5 years ago and had not revisited the policy since. He hung in the void for an indifferent moment. A speck of yellow. A mote of dust in someone else's ocean. Then the ship found him. It was not a ship exactly. It was more like a moving cathedral made of iron and spite. The prow bore the double-headed eagle of the Imperium of man picked out in gold leaf, the wingspan of the Aquila itself as long as a city bus. And every gun port, sensor array, and observation blister bristled with the kind of defensive architecture that suggested the designers had assumed the universe was trying to kill them at all times. They had not been wrong. The Saint's Promise, a light cruiser of the Imperial Navy, third of her name, was running silent at the edge of the Viridian Reach when her Auspex bank started screaming in a choir of machine spirit panic that woke half the raiding crew from their bunks. Lieutenant Navigator Sephiron Tau, his third eye weeping blood onto the brass deck plates of the observation blister, peeled himself off the helm console and croaked into the ship's internal vox. Real space anomaly, bearing 000 by -4. Not warp. I repeat, not warp. There is no warp signature. There is no anything signature. There is a man, Captain Salinos Varix, 5th son of a 6th-tier hive noble house, would not normally have left the command throne to investigate a sensor ghost. He had been briefed. He had been briefed 600 times in his career, never to leave the command throne for a sensor ghost. He left the command throne. He climbed down the bronze ladder to the main observation deck. He looked at the screen, and he saw a man. And his first thought was that the man was the most boring-looking human he had ever seen. And his second thought, tapping into a lifetime of Imperial conditioning, was that boring-looking humans did not survive in the vacuum of space without void suits, Geller fields, or the breath of the Emperor himself. He ordered a hail on every known frequency. No response. He ordered a tractor beam activation. The chief engine seer on the Engineerium deck, Magos Sutra, 9, voxed back that the tractor beam's machine spirit had refused to engage, which was the first time in his service that a tractor beam had ever expressed an opinion about anything, and was probably a sign of either corruption or heresy. Varix ordered a boarding shuttle. The shuttle was halfway across the void when the bald man turned his head toward it, raised one hand in what might have been a wave, and then was simply on the bridge. Not teleported, not stepping out of a portal, just suddenly standing between the helm officer and the port cogitator bank, his yellow suit uncreased, his cape still moving as though there was a wind in this windless metal room. Varix, to his eternal credit, did not scream. He drew his sidearm, a Mars pattern las pistol, whose machine spirit had been blessed 3 times by 3 different tech priests of the Lathe worlds, and put a ruby beam into the bald man's chest at a range of 3 meters. The beam hit. The bald man did not. The bald man reached up and caught the next beam in his palm. It fizzled out against his skin. Varix fired the magazine dry. The bald man waited. Then Varix did the only sensible thing. He lowered his pistol, made the sign of the Aquila across his breastplate, and said, "Identify yourself, in the Emperor's name." "Saitama," said Saitama. "I'm a hero, for fun. Where's the bathroom?" He was told. He used it. They brought him a ration bar, which he ate, and another, and a third. He was interrogated for 18 hours by a Magos Biologus, a senior tactical officer, 2 priests of the ecclesiarchy, and Lieutenant Navigator Tau, none of whom was able to induce him to say anything more interesting than variations on the phrase, "I'm a hero for fun." the Magos Biologis's augmetic eye, which could resolve subcellular structures at a distance of 4 kilometers and could read the chemical composition of a teardrop off a living face, recorded 2,400 separate readings of the bald man and could not give a coherent explanation for any of them. The specimen's biology is consistent with baseline human, the Magos reported, his voice modulator carefully stripped of inflection, and also inconsistent with it in several readings simultaneously, as though it is human and is also something else, and the something else is very polite about not being noticed. The saint's promise made orbit around the hive world of Veronarius 7 days later. Veronarius was a world of layered cities reaching downward into poisoned rock, of manufactoria that never slept, of prayers that never stopped, and underneath the prayers, of things that never died. The lower you went, the worse it got. And by sublevel 900, the things that lived there had stopped being fully human in any meaningful sense generations ago. By sublevel 1100, they had started worshipping things older than the Emperor. By sublevel 1400, the things that lived there had started building shrines out of the bones of other things, and the things beneath the shrines were listening. The underhive was a pressure cooker that had been simmering for 10,000 years and was overdue to blow. It blew on the same day that Saitama set foot on the planet. The greenskin infestation that had been quietly consolidating for 3 standard years in sublevels 1100 to 1200 finally boiled over. Orks are not patient creatures, but these particular orks had been unusually disciplined because their war boss, a brute so ugly that even other orks found him aesthetically offensive, had decided that he wanted to take the upper hive instead of just the lower hive, and to do that, he needed an army instead of a tribe. He had built an army, 40,000 greenskins, shod in stolen flak armor, armed with crude rocket launchers repurposed from looted heavy weapons, mounted on squig riders, on bike does, on tanks the size of hab blocks that had been welded together from parts of 18 different vehicles by mech boys who were either brilliant or had just stopped caring about physics. They burst from the underhive in a wave that smelled of crude oil and burnt meat, and the PDF regiments manning the cordon at sublevel 280 were simply not ready. And then there was the girl. Kalia Varun had not been born in the upper hive. She had been born in sublevel 720, in a section that the administratum clerks called the Ash Warrens, because the floor was 2 meters of compacted ash, and the air tasted like inhaling a forge. Her mother had been a textile worker who had died of lung rot at 36. Her father had been one of the things that lived down there, and had been quietly absorbed by the people who watched things down there, and had not come back. Kalia had grown up with a stolen lasgun and a stolen knife, and a pragmatic philosophy that held as its central tenet that the Emperor protected, but only if you helped him do it. She had joined a gang called the Spinebreakers at 14. She had assumed leadership at 19, when the previous leader had been shot in the face during a turf dispute over a water reclamation plant. She was 23 now, and she had been in the lower hive for the last 6 days, chasing a rumor that there was a saint walking among the habs. She had not believed in saints until she saw him. He was sitting on a cargo crate in the Warren Central Market, eating a meal tray of protein paste that someone had given him, surrounded by children who were climbing on his cape like it was a bouncy castle. He did not seem to mind. He did not seem to notice. He had a face like an egg. Kalia walked up to him. "Are you the saint?" she said. "I'm a hero for fun," he said, "but everyone is calling you the saint of the one punch." He blinked at her with the slow, calm, slightly confused blink of a man who has been told something he had not thought about and is now thinking about it. "Oh," he said, "that's weird." Kalia, who had made her career on reading people in the half-second before they read her back, decided in that moment that this man was exactly what he appeared to be, and exactly not what he appeared to be, and that she was going to stick close to him anyway, because the upper hive was about to be eaten, and the only thing she had ever trusted in was stronger than her. Above them, the green wave crashed upward. Saitama heard it the way he heard everything, which was to say, slightly after everyone else, because his brain had long since stopped bothering with early warning systems. There were explosions. There was screaming. Then there was much louder screaming. and a weight of sound that was the footfalls of thousands of greenskins running in the same direction at the same time. He stood up. The children tumbled off his cape. "I think I should go check that out," he said. "I'll come with you," Kalia said. He looked at her. "It's dangerous." "I'm from sub-level 720, she said. "Dangerous is where I grew up." He considered this. "Okay," he said, "but stay behind me." They went up. The greenskins met them on the transit concourse at level 412, in a corridor wide enough for 4 Leman Russ battle tanks to drive abreast. The war boss, who had named himself Grizzlefang the Getter because he had once bitten a tank commander in half and had felt poetic about it, was at the head of the assault. He was 4 meters tall. He had a choppa the size of a small wind turbine. He had a power claw he had taken off a dead space marine whose chapter he had not bothered to identify. Saitama walked to the front of the corridor. He put his hands in his pockets. The war boss charged. Saitama stepped aside. The war boss crashed past him, lost his footing on the ferrocrete, staggered for half a second, and Saitama's right hand came out of his pocket and patted him, once, on the back of his skull. The sound the war boss's armored cranium made was the sound of a cathedral bell being struck by a small but extremely committed hammer. The war boss flew forward, hit the far wall of the corridor at a velocity that the corridor's structural engineers would later use as a teaching example of why you never assume loads are static, and punched through 3 bulkheads before coming to rest in sub-level 411. He was not dead. Ork. He was reasonably intact, but he was very confused and very still, and his choppa had bent into a shape that no longer resembled a choppa. The greenskins behind him, who had been chanting the wah with the enthusiasm of a species whose entire psychology ran on the premise that violence was the highest form of love, suddenly discovered a new emotion. They did not know what to call it. The humans would later call it fear. It did not catch on, but it worked. The corridor became very quiet. Saitama scratched his head. "Is that the boss?" he asked. Kalia, who was watching from behind a blown-out promethium pipe with a tactically sensible expression on her face, nodded. "I think that was the boss." "Good," Saitama said. "Want to get something to eat?" "I didn't finish my paste." They got something to eat. Kalia did most of the talking over the next 3 days. She told him about the Empire. She told him about the Emperor. She told him about the Tyranids, who came on living ships and ate everything. She told him about the warp, which she described with the careful, slightly awed half-knowledge of someone whose own grandmother had once traded her own eyes to a thing that lived in it. She told him about the giant monsters in the stars. She told him about the giant monsters under the hive. She told him about the giant monsters in the dreams of the people who didn't sleep properly. He listened to her, mostly with his mouth full. He had questions, but they were the questions of a man who had not had a question in years. And the questions came out slowly, like birds that had been roosting in his mind for a long time, and were now realizing the door was open. Why did the people here work all day? Why did nobody smile? Why did nobody make eye contact with each other on the transit? Why did the children's drawings always have guns in them? Kids here draw guns because they like them? Kalia ventured. Back home, kids draw monsters, Saitama said. And then they draw the heroes who fight them, not the guns. She did not know what to make of this. She tucked it into the part of her brain where she kept things that did not fit the shape of anything she already believed, and decided to revisit it later. The demonic incursion happened on the 4th day. By this point, the entire underhive of Veronarius was whispering about the saint. The ecclesiarchy was in a panic, because they had not authorized a saint, and saint authorization was a deeply regulated bureaucratic process that involved applications to the Synod Sancta on Terra, a wait of approximately 7 standard years, a theological review board, and at least one formal exaltation in the Temple of the Emperor Reborn. Having a bald man with a yellow suit and a white cape materialize out of a warpless void, perform miracles, and refuse to do the paperwork was causing the local Cardinal Arch to use words in his sermons that the Missionaris Galaxia normally reserved for the very worst kinds of heretics. The Inquisition was interested. Inquisitor Morton Heilgrat of the Ordo Xenos, a thin man with a face like a wet hatchet and the habit of asking questions in sequences of 3, arrived at the planet aboard his personal vessel, the Spear of Compunction, and demanded custody of the anomaly for examination. Hellbrand, who had been watching Saitama's actions through a haze of surveillance servitors that he had installed in every cloth the bald man had touched in the last 7 days, had a different view. He sat in his own strategium aboard the Spear, surrounded by cogitator banks running analyses he had not authorized anyone to run, and considered the data. The Saint had killed a war boss with a slap. The Saint had not aged visibly since his arrival, despite the natural decay of his travel rations. The Saint had been recorded walking in directions that, when charted, formed no pattern that the cogitators could recognize, although when Hellbrand had looked at the same charts and squinted, the shapes did look a little like an egg. But that was probably a coincidence. What Hellbrand wanted most of all was to know what the bald man was, not as a war asset, not as a threat to the Imperium, not as a saint or a heretic or a miracle, but as a categorical thing. Was he a perpetual, like the old stories whispered of Vulcan? Was he a weapon of some older enemy, designed to look harmless? Was he a being that the Emperor himself had sent to test the faith of mankind? Hellbrand did not believe in coincidences. He believed in contingency. He believed in the long game. And the long game, he decided, would not be played by locking the Saint in a cell. He went to see the Saint. Instead, he found him in the mid-hive district of Hab Tertiary Kappa, 19, sitting on a wall outside a school, handing out ration bars to children who stared at him with the mixture of awe and suspicion that children in the Imperium always reserved for adults who did not have guns. Hellbrand sat beside him. "You understand what you are doing, don't you?" he said. "I'm giving out food," Saitama said. "I'm asking if you understand the political implications of what you are doing," Hellbrand said. "I'm not very good at politics," Saitama said. Hellbrand considered this. Hellbrand had been a servant of the Inquisition for 63 years. He had interrogated perpetuals. He had interrogated abominable intelligences. He had interrogated a Slaneshi daemon prince once, with only a force sword, a copy of the Lectitio Divinitatis, and the tremendous willpower of a man who had spent 15 years studying the expression patterns of beings who had no faces. He had not, before this moment, interrogated a man who had nothing in particular to say. "You give out food," Hellbrand said, "and the children remember. The children grow up. The children tell their children. And their children's children begin to ask why there isn't more food, and why someone who looked like you doesn't come every day, and why the Emperor, who loves them so much, hasn't sent more people like you." Saitama chewed his ration bar. "That seems like a long time to think ahead," he said. "The Imperium thinks in millennia," Hellbrand said. "I think in lunch," Saitama said. Hellbrand laughed. It was a small laugh. It surprised both of them. Hellbrand stood. "I will not attempt to detain you," he said. "Thank you," Saitama said. "You are welcome," Hellbrand said. "I will, however, recommend to the Cardinal Arch that you not be formally canonized as a saint until the Synod Sancta on Terra has had the opportunity to review the matter." "Sure," Saitama said. Hellbrand paused on his way back down the street. "You should not bring that girl with you into the upper hive," he said. "Why not?" Saitama said. "Because she is from the underhive, and the upper hive has rules about who is allowed to walk on which level." "That's stupid," Saitama said. Hellbrand did not respond to this, because agreeing would have been treason, and disagreeing would have been honest, and he had spent his entire career learning the difference. He walked away. He did not warn the bald man about the Cardinal Arch. The Cardinal Arch had to make his own mistakes. The Cardinal Arch was named Lorcan Vaunt, and he had not made his own mistakes in 30 years. He had instead spent those 30 years hoarding them in a vault in his memory and using them, when appropriate, as weapons. He had decided, 5 years ago, that the Emperor was not coming back, and that the only hope for mankind was the priesthood itself, and that he, Lorcan Vaunt, was the priesthood. He had arranged for Cardinal Arch Trajectus of Veron Tertius to be assigned to the Calixus sector, had arranged for Cardinal Arch Hippolytos of Veron Tertius to be assassinated by a person who was subsequently never identified, and had arrived on Veron Tertius with the modest title of missionary to the lower hive and the immodest intention of becoming its spiritual dictator. The Saint of the One Punch was a complication. Vaunt had read the reports. Vaunt had watched the footage. Vaunt had calculated the political implications of a man who could kill a daemon prince with a slap, drawing followers away from the official imperial cult at the rate of approximately 7,000 new believers per day. Vaunt decided the saint had to die, or at least had to leave, and he did not care which. He reached out to his contacts on the Sanctum Telepathica in the Calixis sector and arranged for a psyker team to be inserted onto Veronarius under the cover of a routine pilgrimage. The psykers were instructed to use a particular ritual of binding, dating from the forgotten era of Old Night, that would strip the saint of his will and turn him into a holy relic. The relic could then be processed through the proper imperial channels and would draw off the worst of the cult of personality. Vaunt considered this elegant. Vaunt did not consider that the saint was paying attention. Saitama was not paying attention. Saitama was on the roof of a manufactorum in the lower hive, watching the Tyranid invasion in person. It had come sooner than expected. A splinter fleet of Hive Fleet Kraken, headed by a synapse creature the Imperium would later classify as a Norn queen in its own right, had translated into real space on the far side of the Veronarius system, and was now accelerating through the outer planets with the inevitability of a glacier. The orbital defenses of Veronarius, which consisted of one Battlefleet Veron squadron under Commodore Lysander Hoke, and a constellation of orbital fortresses that had not been meaningfully refit since M36, were engaging the leading bioships in a running battle that was, in the technical military sense, going about as well as a man trying to fight a forest fire with a water pistol. Hellbrand had ordered the saint to be brought to his strategium. The saint had refused on the grounds that he wanted to watch the fleet. Hellbrand had ordered the saint to be brought to his strategium again. The saint had refused again on the grounds that he was out of ration bars and was trying to find some. Hellbrand had ordered a custodian to bring the ration bars. The saint had eaten them. Hellbrand had ordered the saint to come. The saint had said he would come later. Hellbrand had decided to let the saint come later because he estimated he had about 9 hours before the Tyranids reached Atmo, and he wanted to use every minute of those 9 hours on something more productive than arguing with a man who did not understand the Imperial Navy. The orbital battle went badly. The lead bioship, sized somewhere between a battleship and a small moon, shrugged off macro cannon broadsides that had crippled Imperial cruisers of equivalent mass in previous engagements. Its adaptive biology, which could reconfigure chitin plating in the equivalent of a human blink, was simply not what the Imperium had designed their weapons for. Within 7 hours, 2 Imperial cruisers had been reduced to drifting hulks. The orbital fortresses were at 40% functionality, and Commodore Hoke was preparing a full retreat with what was left of his tattered line. Then the saint decided to go. He did not tell anyone he was going. He simply stood up from the roof where he had been eating ration bars, patted Kalia on the head, and walked onto the manufactorum's external cargo gantry. From there, he jumped. Not in the direction of the ship-to-ship battle. He jumped up through the atmosphere, through the void. He stood in the black between Veronarius and the Tyranid fleet, and he thought about things for a moment. He had not thought about anything in a while. He had not needed to. He had been too strong to need to think. The fact that he had to think now was, he realized, perhaps the point. He put his fist forward. He aimed at the nearest bioship, which was the size of a city. He pulled his fist back. He swung. The first hit was a normal punch. It carved the front third of the bioship off in a single arc. The remaining 2/3 spun in the void, leaking plasma and bioacidic gore into the vacuum. The second hit was on the second largest bioship in the spearhead. That one, Saitama took more seriously. He thought about it. He thought about the children in the Hab districts he had visited, who had stared at his cape with eyes that had seen too much and not enough in equal measure. He thought about Kalia, who had told him that her grandmother had traded her eyes to a thing in the warp and who had given him, that afternoon, a small torn piece of paper with her address written on it in case he ever wanted to come back. He thought about what would happen to all of these people if the bioships reached Atmo. He threw his second punch. It was the third one. It was thrown with intent that he had not known he still possessed. The second bioship, slightly larger than the first, came apart in a way that involved fewer pieces than it should have. Its constituent biomass was reduced, cleanly and completely, to a cloud of gas that was approximately the size of a small moon. His name for the third punch, which he had been making up as he went, was Sirius Series. Vertical punch. He directed it downward, through the entire forward edge of the Tyranid spearhead, sweeping left to right. The lance was not equipped with that kind of power. The orbital fortresses were not equipped with that kind of power. The Saint, alone in the void, with nothing but his yellow suit and his cape, was. The Tyranid spearhead evaporated. The lance of bioships that had threatened Veronarius itself was gone, scattered as a thin haze of organic particulate across the system's ecliptic plane. The Imperial Navy, behind him, stared at the haze in incomprehension. Sister Celestine Verata, the Lord General Militant in command of the Adepta Sororitas detachment on Veronarius, later wrote in her personal diary that the next engagement of the Imperial line had been, in her professional military opinion, anticlimactic. The remaining Tyranid vessels, deprived of their synapse mass, at the front of the fleet, and the singular directing intelligence of their Norn queen, lost their operational coherence. They began to swim in uncoordinated patterns, attacking each other, attacking asteroids, attacking nothing. They were picked off one by the Imperial line over the next 72 hours, although there was a small but persistent argument among the surviving ratings about whether the Saints' intervention had been, in the greater strategic context, too much, because it would be very difficult now for anyone on Veronarius to think of the Imperium as the indispensable shield. Hellbrand, watching from his strategium, made a sound that was possibly a groan, but might have been a laugh. The Saint landed in the Manufactorum district 3 hours after he had jumped. Kalia was waiting for him. She was waiting because she understood, instinctively and without being told, that the man in the yellow suit was the kind of person you waited for. Saitama handed her a ration bar. "I'm hungry," he said. "We have ration bars in the Manufactorum," Kalia said. "Those are the ones I like least," Saitama said. "I noticed," Kalia said. They walked home. It was on the walk home that the Lord of Change made his presence felt. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, the architect of fate, was not a god who believed in direct intervention. Tzeentch believed in Plan B and Plan C and Plan A prime and Plan A double prime and 17,000 variations on a single turning point in a single mortal life. He had been watching the bald man since his arrival in the system, because the bald man was, in the warp, a kind of wound. He was a tear in the fabric of causality, a thing that existed outside of the great game, a being whose presence in the material universe was not a violation of plan but a contradiction of plan. Tzeentch did not like contradictions. Tzeentch liked plans. Tzeentch had been trying, since the second day, to fold the Saint into his own grand designs. He had tried the Psyker binding ritual that Cardinal Vane had unwittingly enabled. He had tried to draw the Saint's attention through a series of carefully arranged visions and portents that had manifested as brief, vivid dreams in which the bald man saw a ghostly rooster and a ghostly question mark and a ghostly door that was slightly ajar. The Saint had, in every single case, ignored the visions and gone back to sleep. Tzeentch had, in every single case, grown more frustrated. The Lord of Change's plan at this final stage was small. He had chosen a low-level psyker in the bureaucrat ranks of the administratum, a woman named Phaedra Ultan, who had spent her career approving mining permits on the eastern equatorial shelf. Phaedra Ultan had a small, secret grievance against the ecclesiarchy. The Lord of Change had amplified it. Phaedra Ultan had a small, secret envy of the Saint's popularity. The Lord of Change had amplified it. Phaedra Ultan had a small, secret wish that she, too, could be canonized and adored. The Lord of Change had arranged for the canonization papers to be falsified, for the officio diabolist infiltrators in the Cardinal Arch's staff to fast-track them, for an unsigned commissarial transcript of a supposedly recent vision quest to be appended to the Saint's dossier, and for the Synod Sancta on Terra to receive the falsified materials via a convoluted bureaucratic series of stamps that would, by imperial administratum standards, take approximately 6 standard years to reverse. The Saint, of course, did not know any of this. The Saint was eating the better ration bar that Kalia had stolen from a manufactorum that had been left unguarded in the chaos of the Tyranid siege. The Saint was thinking about nothing in particular. The Lord of Change did not see a need to add anything to the Saint. The Lord of Change wanted the Saint to be confused at the right moment, in the right way, so that the saint would do something the Lord of Change had been waiting 10,000 years for him to do. The right moment arrived 2 days later. Kalia had brought the saint to the upper hive. Against the explicit regulations of Hab Tertiary Kappa 1-9 and the unspoken social conventions of every level above it, because she had decided that her papers were clean and that she was going to walk on level 290 anyway. They were walking. They were eating a new type of ration bar that the saint had discovered, which was amber-colored and tasted faintly of burnt sugar. They walked past a shrine to the emperor that had been recently defaced by graffiti depicting the saint's bald profile in gold spray. They walked past a manufactorum where the workers, hearing the saint was in the area, had stopped their machines and were standing in the open doorways watching him. They walked past a small chapel where a missionary was conducting a service that had been converted, without the missionary's knowledge or consent, into a Saint of the One-Punch devotion, complete with candles, icons, and the chanting of the saint's name to a melody that the missionary later admitted was extremely catchy. They were walking past the Administratum Plaza on level 290 when Phaedra Ultan stepped out from behind a pillar and pointed a force rod at the saint's chest. The force rod was a relic of the Great Crusade, the kind that had been used to bind traitor psychers during the Horus Heresy, and it was keyed to a particular binding ritual that had been carved into its casket by a magos whose name had been forgotten and whose intent had been the suppression of psychic mutation, not the forcible canonization of a heretical figure. Phaedra Ultan held the rod up. The rod clicked. The rod, presumably, was supposed to do something. It did not do something. It tried to do something. The saint looked at it with mild interest. Phaedra Ultan blinked. The saint blinked. The rod tried again. The rod failed again. The saint reached out gently and took the rod from Phaedra Ultan's hand, turned it over, looked at it, and handed it back. "I think it's broken," he said. Then he walked on, and Phaedra Ultan stood in the plaza, holding her broken relic, and the sorcerous connection that the Lord of Change had built through her mind came apart all at once like a brick wall struck in the middle by a runaway truck. Phaedra Ultan screamed. Phaedra Ultan fell over. Phaedra Ultan was fine. The Lord of Change, in the warp, considered his options and decided that the saint was, at this point, more trouble than he was worth, and would be left to his own devices. This was the first time in 10,000 years that the Lord of Change had given up on a plan before it succeeded. He attributed it to budgetary constraints. He did not think about it further. In the aftermath of the saint's intervention against the Tyranids, the Imperium on Veron Tertius breathed. The planetary governor declared a week of feasting. The Cardinal Arch declared a week of Thanksgiving. The Administratum declared a week of double shifts to process the backlog of paperwork that the saint's actions had generated because apparently defeating a splinter fleet caused 500,000 additional forms to need approval. The Ecclesiarchy declared that the saint was not yet canonized, but that the Synod Sancta would be petitioned. The Inquisition declared that everything was going according to plan, which was a lie, but a necessary one. The saint sat in Kalia's hab, which was small and clean and smelled of recaf and starch, and watched her cook a real meal for the first time since his arrival. She had obtained, by a series of black market transactions that she refused to discuss in detail, the ingredients for something called chalked udon, which was a hybrid of two cuisines from two different worlds and was, she assured him, delicious. He waited. She cooked. They ate. The saint ate 6 bowls. He sat back. He felt, for the first time in a long time, the small, quiet, very specific happiness that comes from eating a real meal in a clean kitchen at the end of a long day. Kalia watched him eat. She did not say anything. She thought about how, in 100 years, when her great-grandchildren asked her about the time the saint came to Veron Tertius, she would tell them about the way he ate 6 bowls of udon and smiled slightly. She thought this was the most important thing she would ever tell anyone, more important than the wars or the miracles or the politics. The saint, for his part, thought about how to get home. He had asked Hellbrand. Hellbrand had, after consulting with the tech priest Magos, explained that the technology to return someone between realities was theoretical, was heavily experimental, would involve the construction of an astropathic relay array of unprecedented scale, would take years to fully construct, and would have a non-trivial chance of collapsing local spacetime. The saint had nodded. He had decided, then, that he would go home when the device was ready. and not before. In the meantime, he would do what he had always done. He would punch monsters, he would give out food, he would help with the disasters, he would wait. This is the part of the story where, if it were a movie, the camera would pull back, and we would see Veronarius from orbit, with its towers of glittering iron, its forests of industrial smokestacks, its rim of orbital defense platforms, its scratched and dented Imperial Navy cruisers patrolling the inner system, its single yellow-suited figure standing on the highest spire, cape flapping in a wind that did not exist, and we would feel, for a moment, the weight of all of it. The weight of a galaxy that had been at war with itself for 10,000 years, and the weight of a single very bored man who had decided to stay and help with it anyway. This is also the part where, if it were a movie, we would be told that this single very bored man would, in the next 6 months, kill 6 war bosses, 14 greater demons, 3 Norn queens, the planetary governor of the Eastern Hemisphere, in a duel that did not draw blood, and that everyone agreed was somehow embarrassing for the governor. A sister of battle who had been mind-controlled by a Slaneshi cabal, and then unmind-controlled with a slap to the side of the head, and a Necron overlord who had decided to wake up in the eastern sector, and who was put back to sleep without anybody quite understanding how. We would be told that the cult of the Saint of the One Punch would expand to 4 additional sectors. We would be told that the ecclesiarchy, after 6 years of bureaucratic slogging, would officially declare the saint not yet canonizable on the grounds that he had not actually died, which was, technically, an impediment to sainthood, but that nonetheless the saint's name would be added to the litany of heroes read during Ministorum services in 240 worlds. We would not be told, because movies rarely are, that the saint was lonely. He was lonely because everyone he met was either worshipping him, hunting him, commissioning a portrait of him, or trying to figure out how to use him as a strategic asset. He was lonely because he had not felt lonely in years back home. Because back home he had Genos, who was annoying, and King, who was annoying, and Fubuki, who was also annoying, and a cat that sat on his head on Sundays. None of those things existed on Veronarius. Kalia was the closest thing he had to a friend. He did not want to crush her by telling her that. He also did not want to crush her by leaving without saying goodbye. He said goodbye on a Wednesday. The dimensional device was ready. Hellbrand had been unusually quiet about it. The tech priest Magos had been unusually quiet about it. The Adeptus Mechanicus contingent on Veronarius had been unusually quiet about it. The saint had not pressed the issue. He had come to the chamber in the morning with Kalia, who had stolen a small torn piece of paper with her address written on it, just in case, and had handed the paper to the saint for the second time, and had taken it back for the second time when the saint had handed it over. The saint had stood on the platform. The dimensional device had hummed. The portal had opened. The saint had seen, through the portal, the skyline of Z City, distorted slightly but recognizably there. He thought about the people who had begged him not to leave. He thought about the children in the Hab districts. He thought about Kalia, who was watching him from the observation gantry, her face unreadable in the way that only a former hive-ganger's face could be unreadable. He thought about Hellbrand, who had, in the last 6 months, gone from a thinly veiled skeptic to a careful, cautious, somewhat reluctant admirer, and whose final assessment of the saint in his personal cogitator log would read, "The anomaly is not a threat to the Imperium. The anomaly is, however, a source of hope that the Imperium does not know what to do with. His presence has done more for the morale of the underhive populations than a dozen victory parades and 100 Ministorum preachings. He should be allowed to depart. The Emperor works in ways I cannot predict, but in my heart I believe that the saint, if he is what he says he is, will come back. If he is not what he says he is, then nothing I do will matter. Either way, he should go." He stepped through the portal. He appeared in a city. It was his city. The buildings were the right buildings. The sky was the right color. The air smelled, faintly, of pollution and onigiri and the neighbor's cat. He stood in an alley. He stood in his alley. He went home. His apartment had been empty for 6 months, but it was still his apartment. The futon was still his futon. The refrigerator was still empty. The walls were still the right color. He looked around. He sat on the futon. He sat for a long time. Then he stood. He got dressed. He put on his yellow suit. He put on his white cape. He opened the door. The city, his city, was waiting. The monsters, his monsters, were out there. The heroes, his heroes, were out there. The daily routine of being a hero for fun was waiting to be resumed, like a song that had been paused and was now ready to play again. He stepped outside. The sun was bright. The wind was warm. There was, in the distance, the sound of a small monster roaring. He smiled. He had not smiled on Veronarius in the entire 6 months he had been there, and somewhere, in the grim darkness of a far future he had just left, Kalia Varen sat in her hab on sub-level 720, holding a small torn piece of paper with 2 sets of handwriting on it, and decided that she was going to find him again, because in the entire span of her short, brutal, smoky life, the bald man had, in one casual motion, handed her back the piece of paper she had slipped him and said, "Of course I'll come back if you ever need me." And she had believed him, and that belief was, somehow, more powerful than any miracle she had ever seen. She folded the paper. She put it in her coat. She went out into the underhive, into the smoke and the yelling and the noise. And she went to find her gang, because in the grim darkness of the far future, there was only war, but there was also Kalia Varen. And she was, somewhere, going to bring the Saint of the One Punch back, because he had told her he would come. And Saints of the One Punch, it turned out, kept their word.